Hello and welcome to Apple with the Doc. Today we'll be talking about metformin and malaria and possibly Ebola. So let's get into it. So the first bit of news that we have is about a new drug for the flu. It is flu season. In the past, I did make a podcast about the flu, or the vaccines for the flu, and I probably will make another one that's on my topic list for flu and why it's important to get the flu vaccine, because the flu used to be really bad in the past, and which is why there's the push for flu vaccines now, even though our medicine's gotten better. Part of that reason is we have vaccines. So the first drug that we have, originally we had a drug called Tamiflu. This was used in cases of flu where you couldn't really tolerate the symptoms of flu. Normally what happens if you get the flu is you're told to go home, rest, drink fluids, and you'll get better. And without the use of medication or antibiotics, which is important. If you have the flu, don't take any antibiotics because your problem isn't a bacteria, it's a virus. And so we have a new drug called baloxavir. It works differently than Tamiflu, and so which is actually a really good thing because I believe about 20 years it's been since the new drug for the flu. I'll have to go back to the notes to get an accurate description of that. But this drug, it inhibits the virus cap-dependent endonuclease, and which is different from Tamiflu, which actually attacks the neuraminidase protein that's on the flu. And so this is what they're considering a new class of drug for the flu. Again, if you have the flu, don't really go and seek out antibiotics because that's not really your issue. And these drugs are generally there for people who can't really tolerate the flu, who are really sickly. And so it's used for that. And so they were able to do a clinical trial of this using around 1,800 patients, a little bit more than that. And it shortened the symptoms of the flu by 24 hours. And so it proved to be very similar in its efficacy with Tamiflu. And so a little bit more about how this drug actually works. So Tamiflu, what it does, it stops the actual release of the virus. So when a virus attacks your body, it attaches itself to the cell, and then the cell absorbs the virus, and then within the cell itself, the virus will start to attack where the DNA source is, the nucleus of the cell, and it'll hijack the cell's replication nature of the cell, where it would then use the cell's own factory to make it more of itself. So, and this is one of the reasons why viruses aren't considered to be a living organism. Viruses require the use of another cell or another organism in order to reproduce, another species, if you will. Virus can't mate with other viruses. Well, they need the use of another cell. So it could be like a human cell, it could be a bacteria, it could be yeast, which is kind of rare, but you do have bacteria, you have other animals. And so viruses, since they hijack it's not considered living. And so what Tamiflu does is it stops the release. So if you imagine how, let's say for example, I think poop would be a good example. So if you eat something, you ingest it, right? Similar to how viruses come into your body. If you imagine the food is the virus, and so if you poop out the food, it's similar to how the viruses will come out of the cell. And so they have this budding process what comes out. So if you imagine the poop that's like forming, if you're looking from like a silhouette perspective, poop forms and it comes out that way. That's how viruses come out, and they'll break open and spread to other cells in the body. And so the neuroamidase inhibitors are Tamiflu. What they do is they stop that release from actually happening. So this new drug though happens within the cell. And so, as I mentioned like 10 seconds ago, viruses hijack the replicative systems within the cell. And so this new drug attacks that area, and it stops the mRNA synthesis for this, so like the messenger RNA. And it basically stops the whole budding process. So when the virus enters, it won't be able to replicate itself. So it's like that piece of chewing bubble gum that just stays in your intestines for like 7 years, which I think is a myth, by the way. But it is difficult for your body to digest bubble gum. But I digress from there. And so you have the mRNA synthesis that's inhibited, and so it can't replicate further, which is how this new medication is actually working. So that's why they consider it first of its class, a new class of drug. And continuing the topic of medications, metformin has been shown to reduce the risk of age-related macular degeneration using a retrospective study from Taiwan, especially in patients, those who have diabetes. One of the problems with diabetes is you do go blind. That bit of knowledge that's everyone knows about is true. If you don't know about that, recently there's a fat shaming, anti-fat shaming lady who came on to the tabloids and said that diabetes made her blind, which was a great thing because she couldn't see her haters. Sure, if you want to see it that way, sure, go ahead. But diabetes does pose a risk for blindness. The other thing is age-related macular degeneration, and it's where you start to have retina that began to die. I'm not quite sure that we have found out the exact reason for that, but it does happen with age. It can happen even without diabetes, but those who have diabetes accelerate the process. So it's like you have like the risk for testicular cancer, but then you stick your testicles in a microwave, and oh yeah, that's a South Park reference. And then you get cancer, so you just increase your risk for the disease. And so the rationale behind how metformin is so great for this is that it inhibits the inflammation and the oxidative stress that can help reduce the risk of AMD. And so when they talk about oxidative stress, what they mean are reactive oxygen species, where you have like radicals of oxygen roaming around, which are actually useful, but too much of it can cause damage. And they're useful for like destroying foreign pathogens such as bacteria. They kill it with using that reactive oxygen species, that sort of thing. And so they did a study in Taiwan, which showed it greatly reduced the risk of developing age-related macular degeneration, AMD, not to be confused with the graphic card company. So to continue along, the next bit of news is about malaria, and they were able to train dogs to help detect malaria, especially in children. Now, using dogs is nothing particularly new. It's actually quite handy. You get a nice companion, and it's also relatively quicker, I believe. It's useful for those who have diabetes type 1, who are about to go into ketoacidosis if they're taking too much of their insulin, or if they're going into, or if they didn't take enough of their insulin and they're about to go into diabetic ketoacidosis. Dogs can help in sniffing that. One of the things is you look for is this acetone breath or the fruity smell that occurs if you're about to go into diabetic ketoacidosis. And so I believe that's where the dogs are smelling. They tried using dogs for cancer. I don't think that one panned out too well. But for this one, they used malaria. The dogs are able to actually sniff it out within children. And so what they did was, let me back up a little bit and go into how what's the science behind this. And so they were able to prove that when a person is infected with malaria, that their aroma actually changes. And so this change in aroma can be noticed by these dogs. And so they give children socks to sleep in overnight, and the dogs can sniff it and identify what the who has infected with malaria. And so this is, I would say it's a great thing. This is just like in the trial phases. The logical reasoning behind this comes from the fact that if you can treat every person who has malaria, you stop the spread. And malaria is spread by, most of you probably know, is by mosquitoes. And they'll suck the blood from an infected human and transfer that along to another human who's not infected, perpetuating the life cycle. But if you were able to stop this transmission, not in the transmission process, but stop the individual from being infected, they're not having these cyclical fevers, then you ultimately stop the transmission of malaria and malaria in general. This goes into like where certain aspects of disease eradication. If you stop the number of people who are being infected, then you reduce the chances of other people being infected. Again, this is like in trial phases. I wouldn't trust this completely because they are dogs. And it's not, I would say, hardcore science where you actually do a lab test that indicates the levels of the malaria, the species of malaria. And so one of the things that you do have to remember when you're treating malaria is what type of species you're dealing with. Certain species are located within certain regions, and especially when they come to the U.S., it's kind of difficult to tell. You need to know the species of malaria in order to give certain antibiotics, because some species have developed a resistance. And so, overall, I guess this is a great, helps children not be fearful of needles. Hopefully the dogs aren't used for food. I don't know. So the next bit of news, still talking about children, is Ebola. Currently it is Ebola season, I would say. In the Congo, there is an outbreak, but it's not to the point of calling it an emergency, a public health emergency. And there has been reports of a disproportionate number of children being affected by Ebola. Nearly 60% of the newly reported cases are children under the age of 16, which is concerning because children are slightly not as immunocompetent to take care of this. And so there's a proposed reason why that they're basing this off of tuberculosis, how some children are more affected there's certain factors that go into reason why tuberculosis is spread more among children in certain parts, and some of these reasons were as follows. One of them is that the infectious source. Some could be delayed in identification of whether or not a person has Ebola. By that time, they've already interacted with other children, and increase the exposure to other children as well. The children tend to have a higher contact with each other, so the duration and the intensity of interaction between children is higher than adults. Adults may just shake hands, but children play. They'll tackle each other, play tag. They'll share toys, and so they're at a more higher risk for contracting Ebola. The other thing is that the child's biology in itself, children can become more immunocompromised from things like malaria, HIV, malnutrition, especially malnutrition. You don't have enough nutrition to actually develop the white blood cells and to mount an adequate immune response, which is significant for people who are in the Congo who may be malnutritious. And so this is one of the things that why these are the reasons why they think children might be more affected by Ebola. One of the things is that Ebola outbreaks, when they do occur, they occur in these like remote villages sometimes, and they have certain burial practices within these areas where they stay near a dead body, and they'll wash and clean it. However, the contact with this dead body is what puts these people at risk for actually having contracting Ebola. And so the problem that occurs is when you have a foreign person come in with these hazmat suits, they tend to scare the locals, and so they'll hide dead bodies in their rooms, their houses, underneath the beds. And since a lot of these foreign workers, like let's say a person from America, we know to have respect for another person's property, and we won't go barging in unless you want to like burglarize them, but that's a different story. So we have respect, and so it's more dependent on the people in the village to actually volunteer to help with that. And so there's just like one of the many things that happens with Ebola, especially in these Ebola crises. And it is a shame that more children are affected because children are our future. But there's also other problems and other factors that goes into these foreign countries. So if I haven't made you depressed and made you click off this podcast, thank you for listening. Please do subscribe, follow again. I'm trying to make these weekly. Thank you for listening. You can follow me on iTunes, Google Play, all that fun stuff. Thank you.